War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Aylmer and Louise, Maude, Book 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Renee. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Book 15, Chapter 1. When seeing a dying animal, a man feels a sense of horror. Substance similar to his own is perishing before his eyes. But when it is a beloved and intimate human being that is dying, besides this horror at the extinction of life, there is a severance, a spiritual wound, which, like a physical wound, is sometimes fatal and sometimes heals, but always aches and shrinks at any external irritating touch. After Prince Andrew's death, Natasha and Princess Mary alike felt this, drooping in spirit and closing their eyes before the menacing cloud of death that overhung them. They dared not look life in the face. They carefully guarded their open wounds from any rough and painful contact. Everything, a carriage passing rapidly in the street, a summons to dinner, the maid's inquiry what dress to prepare, or worse still any word of insincere or feeble sympathy, seemed an insult, painfully irritated the wound, interrupting that necessary quiet in which they both tried to listen to the stern and dreadful choir that still resounded in their imagination, and hindered their gazing into those mysterious, limitless vistas that for an instant had opened out before them. Only when alone together were they free from such outrage and pain. They spoke little even to one another, and when they did it was very unimportant matters. Both avoided any allusion to the future. To admit the possibility of a future seemed to them to insult his memory. Still more carefully did they avoid anything relating to him who was dead. It seemed to them that what they had lived through and experienced could not be expressed in words, and that any reference to the details of this life infringed the majesty and sacredness of the mystery that had been accomplished before their eyes. Continued abstention from speech, and constant avoidance of everything that might lead up to the subject, this halting on all sides at the boundary of what they might not mention, brought before their minds with still greater purity and clearness what they were both feeling. But pure and complete sorrow is as impossible as pure and complete joy. Princess Mary, in her position as absolute and independent arbiter of her own fate and guardian and instructor of her nephew, was the first to be called back to life from that realm of sorrow in which she had dwelt for the first fortnight. She received letters from her relations to which she had to reply. The room in which little Nicholas had been put was damp, and he began to cough. Alpátych came to Yaroslav with reports on the state of affairs, and with advice and suggestions that they should return to Moscow to the house on the Voyna Street, which had remained uninjured and needed only slight repairs. Life did not stand still until it was necessary to live. Hard as it was for Princess Mary to emerge from this realm of secluded contemplation in which she had lived till then, and sorry and almost ashamed as she felt to leave Natásha alone, yet the cares of life demanded her attention, and she involuntarily yielded to them. She went through the accounts with Alpátych, conferred with Dessalles about her nephew, and gave orders and made preparations for the journey to Moscow. Natásha remained alone, and from the time Princess Mary began making preparations for departure, held aloof from her too. Princess Mary asked the Countess to let Natásha go with her to Moscow, and both parents gladly accepted this offer, for they saw their daughter losing strength every day and thought that a change of scene and the advice of Moscow doctors would be good for her. "I'm not going anywhere," Natásha replied when this was proposed to her. "Do please just leave me alone," and she ran out of the room, with difficulty refraining from tears of vexation and irritation rather than of sorrow. After she left herself deserted by Princess Mary and alone in her grief, Natásha spent most of the time in her room by herself, sitting huddled up, feet and all, in the corner of the sofa, tearing and twisting something with her slender nervous fingers and gazing intently and fixedly at whatever her eyes chanced to fall on. This solitude exhausted and tormented her, but she was in absolute need of it. As soon as anyone entered she got up quickly, changed her position and expression, and picked up a book or some sewing, evidently waiting impatiently for the intruder to go. She felt all the time as if she might at any moment penetrate that on which, with a terrible questioning too great for her strength, her spiritual gaze was fixed. One day toward the end of December, Natásha, pale and thin, dressed in a black woolen gown, her plaited hair negligently twisted into a knot, was crouched, feet and all, in the corner of her sofa, nervously crumpling and smoothing out an end of her sash while she looked at the corner of the door. She was gazing in the direction in which he had gone, to the other side of the life. And that other side of life, of which she had never before thought, and which had formerly seemed to her so far away and improbable, was now near and more akin and more comprehensible than this side of life, where everything was either emptiness and desolation or suffering and indignity. She was gazing where she knew him to be, but she could not imagine him otherwise than as she had been here. She now saw him again as he had been at Mytishchi, at Troitsa, at Yaroslav. She saw his face, heard his voice, repeated his words and her own, and sometimes devised her words they might have spoken. There he is, lying in an armchair in his velvet cloak, leaning his head on his thin, pale hand. His chest is dreadfully hollow, and his shoulders raised. His lips are firmly closed, his eyes glitter, and a wrinkle comes and goes on his pale forehead. One of his legs twitches just perceptibly, but rapidly. Natásha knows that he is struggling with terrible pain. What is the pain like? Why does he have that pain? What does he feel? How does it hurt him? Thought Natásha. He noticed her watching him, raised his eyes, and began to speak seriously. One thing would be terrible, said he, to bind oneself forever to a suffering man. It would be continual torture. And he looked searching at her. Natásha, as usual, answered before she had time to think what she would say. She said, "This can't go on. It won't. You will get well, quite well." She now saw him from the commencement of that scene and relieved what she had then felt. She recalled his long, sad, and severe look at those words, and understood the meaning of the rebuke of despair in that protracted gaze. "I agreed," Natásha now said to herself, "that it would be dreadful if he always continued to suffer. I said it then only because it would have been dreadful for him, but he understood it differently. He thought it would have been dreadful for me. He then still wished to live and feared death, and I said it so awkwardly and stupidly. I didn't say what I meant. I thought quite differently. Had I said what I thought, I should have said, even if he had to go on dying, to die continually before my eyes, I should have been happy compared with what I am now. Now there is nothing, nobody. Did he know that? No, he didn't know, and never will know it. And now it will never, never be possible to put it right." And now he again seemed to be saying the same words to her, only in her imagination Natásha this time gave him a different answer. She stopped him and said, "Terrible for you, but not for me. You know that for me there is nothing in life but you, and to suffer with you is the greatest happiness for me." And he took her hand and pressed it, as he had pressed it in that terrible evening 4 days before his death. And in her imagination she said other tender and loving words, which she might have said then, but only spoke now. "I love thee. Thee I love, love," she said convulsively, pressing her hands and setting her teeth with a desperate effort. She was overcome by sweet sorrow, and tears were already rising in her eyes. Then she suddenly asked herself to whom she was saying this. Again everything was shrouded in hard, dry perplexity, and again with a strained frown she peered toward the world where he was, and now it seemed to her she was penetrating the mystery. But at the instant when it seemed that the incomprehensible was revealing itself to her in a loud rattle of the door handle struck painfully on her ears. Yansha, her maid, entered the room quickly and abruptly, with a frightened look on her face and showing no concern for her mistress. "Come to your papa at once, please," she said with a strange, excited look. "A misfortune about Peter Ilyitch. A letter," she finished with a sob. End of chapter 1.
Book 15, Chapter 2, read for LibriVox.org. Besides a feeling of aloofness from everybody, Natásha was feeling a special estrangement from the members of her own family. All of them, her father, mother, Sónya, were so near to her, so familiar, so commonplace, that all their words and feelings seemed an insult to the world in which she had been living of late, and she felt not merely indifferent to them but regarded them with hostility. She heard Dunyásha's words about Peter Ilyitch and misfortune, but did not grasp them. What misfortune? What misfortune can happen to them? They just live their own old, quiet, and commonplace life, thought Natásha. As she entered the ballroom, her father was hurriedly coming out of her mother's room. His face was puckered up and wet with tears. He had evidently run out of that room to give vent to the sobs that were choking him. When he saw Natásha, he waved his arms despairingly and burst into convulsively painful sobs that distorted his soft round face. "Pétya, Go, she's calling." And weeping like a child and quickly shuffling on his feeble legs to a chair, he almost fell into it, covering his face with his hands. Suddenly an electric shock seemed to run through Natásha's whole being. Terrible anguish struck her heart, and she felt a dreadful ache, as if something was being torn inside of her and she were dying. But the pain was immediately followed by a feeling of release from the oppressive constraint that had prevented her taking part in life. The sight of her father, the terribly wild cries of her mother that she heard through the door, made her immediately forget herself and her own grief. She ran to her father, but he feebly waved his arm, pointing to her mother's door. Princess Mary, pale and with quivering chin, came out from that room, and taking Natásha by the arm, said something to her. Natásha neither saw nor heard her. She went in with rapid steps, pausing at the door for an instant as if struggling with herself, and then ran to her mother. The countess was lying on an armchair in a strange and awkward position, stretching out and beating her head against the wall. Sónya and the maids were holding her arms. "Natásha! Natásha!" cried the countess. "It's not true! It's not true! He's lying!" "Natásha!" she shrieked, pushing those around her away. "Go away, all of you! It's not true! Killed? Ha! It's not true!" Natásha put one knee on the armchair, stooped over her mother, embraced her, and with unexpected strength raised her, turned her face toward herself, and clung to her. "Mummy, darling, I'm here. My dearest mummy," she kept on whispering, not pausing an instant. She did not let go of her mother, but struggled tenderly with her, demanded a pillow and hot water, and unfastened and tore open her mother's dress. "My dearest, darling mummy, my precious," she whispered incessantly, kissing her head, her hands, her face, and feeling her own irrepressible and streaming tears tickling her nose and cheeks. The countess pressed her daughter's hand, closed her eyes, and became quiet for a moment. Suddenly she sat up with unaccustomed swiftness, glanced vacantly around her, and seeing Natásha began to press her daughter's head with all her strength. Then she turned toward her daughter's face, which was wincing with pain, and gazed long at it. "Natásha, you love me," she said in a soft, trustful whisper. "Natásha, you would not deceive me. You'll tell me the whole truth?" Natásha looked at her with eyes full of tears, and in her look there was nothing but love and an entreaty for forgiveness. "My darling mummy," she repeated, straining all the power of her love to find some way of taking on herself the excess of grief that crushed her mother. And again, in a futile struggle with reality, her mother, refusing to believe that she could live when her beloved boy was killed in the bloom of life, escaped from reality into a world of delirium. Natásha did not remember how that day passed, nor that night, nor the next day and night. She did not sleep and did not leave her mother. Her persevering and patient love seemed completely to surround the countess at every moment, not explaining or consoling, but recalling her to life. During the third night the countess kept very quiet for a few minutes, and Natásha rested her head on the arm of her chair and closed her eyes, but opened them again on hearing the bedstead creak. The countess was sitting up in bed and speaking softly. "How glad I am you have come. You are tired. Won't you have some tea?" Natásha went up to her. "You have improved in looks and grown more manly," continued the countess, taking her daughter's hand. "Mamma, what are you saying?" "Natásha, he is no more, no more." And embracing her daughter, the countess began to weep for the first time. End of Book 15, Chapter 2. This recording is in the public domain. Book 15, Chapter 3, read for LibriVox.org. Princess Mary postponed her departure. Sónya and the count tried to replace Natásha but could not. They saw that she alone was able to restrain her mother from unreasoning despair. For 3 weeks Natásha remained constantly at her mother's side, sleeping on a lounge chair in her room, making her eat and drink, and talking to her incessantly because the mere sound of her tender, caressing tones soothed her mother. The mother's wounded spirit could not heal. Pétya's death had torn from her half her life. When the news of Pétya's death had come, she had been a fresh and vigorous woman of 50, but a month later she left her room a listless old woman, taking no interest in life. But the same blow that almost killed the countess, this second blow, restored Natásha to life. A spiritual wound produced by a rending of the spiritual body is like a physical wound, and, strange as it may seem, just as a deep wound may heal and its edges join, physical and spiritual wounds alike can yet heal completely only as the result of a vital force from within. Natásha's wound healed in that way. She thought her life was ended, but her love for her mother unexpectedly showed her that the essence of life, love, was still active within her. Love awoke, and so did life. Prince Andrew's last days had bound Princess Mary and Natásha together. This new sorrow brought them still closer to one another. Princess Mary put off her departure, and for 3 weeks looked after Natásha as if she had been a sick child. The last weeks passed in her mother's bedroom had strained Natásha's physical strength. One afternoon, noticing Natásha shivering with fever, Princess Mary took her to her own room and made her lie down on the bed. Natásha lay down, but when Princess Mary had drawn the blinds and was going away, she called her back. "I don't want to sleep, Mary. Sit by me a little. You are tired. Try to sleep." "No, no, why did you bring me away? She will be asking for me." "She is much better. She spoke so well today," said Princess Mary. Natásha lay on the bed and in the semi-darkness of the room scanned Princess Mary's face. "Is she like him?" thought Natásha. "Yes, like and yet not like, but she is quite original, strange, new and unknown. And she loves me. What is it in her heart? All that is good, but how? What is her mind like? What does she think about me? Yes, she is splendid. Mary," she said timidly, drawing Princess Mary's hand to herself. "Mary, you mustn't think me wicked, no? Mary, darling, how I love you. Let us be quite friends." And Natásha, embracing her, began kissing her face and hands, making Princess Mary feel shy but happy by this demonstration of her feelings. From that day a tender and passionate friendship, such as exists only between women, was established between Princess Mary and Natásha. They were continually kissing and saying tender things to one another, and spent most of their time together. When one went out, the other became restless and hastened to rejoin her. Together they felt more in harmony with one another than either of them felt with herself when alone. A feeling stronger than friendship sprang up between them, an exclusive feeling of life being possible only in each other's presence. Sometimes they were silent for hours. Sometimes, after they were already in bed, they would begin talking and go on till morning. They spoke most of what was long past. Princess Mary spoke of her childhood, of her mother, her father, and her daydreams. And Natásha, who with a passive lack of understanding had formerly turned away from that life of devotion, submission, and the poetry of Christian self-sacrifice, now feeling herself bound to Princess Mary by affection, learned to love her past too and to understand a side of life previously incomprehensible to her. She did not think of applying submission and self-abnegation to her own life, for she was accustomed to seek other joys, but she understood and loved in another those previously incomprehensible virtues. For Princess Mary, listening to Natásha's tales of childhood and early youth, there also opened out a new and hitherto uncomprehended side of life, belief in life and its enjoyment. Just as before, they never mentioned him so as not to lower, as they thought, their exalted feelings by words. But this silence about him had the effect of making them gradually begin to forget him without being conscious of it. Natásha had grown thin and pale and physically so weak that they all talked about her health, and this pleased her. But sometimes she was suddenly overcome by a fear not only of death but of sickness, weakness, and loss of good looks, and involuntarily she examined her bare arm carefully, surprised at its thinness, and in the morning noticed her drawn and, as it seemed to her, piteous face in her glass. It seemed to her that things must be so, and yet it was dreadfully sad. One day she went quickly upstairs and found herself out of breath. Unconsciously she immediately invented a reason for going down, and then, testing her strength, ran upstairs again, observing the result. Another time, when she called Dunyasha, her voice trembled, so she called her again, though she could hear Dunyasha coming, called her in the deep chest tones in which she had been wont to sing, and listened attentively to herself. She did not know and would not have believed it, but beneath the layer of slime that covered her soul and seemed to her impenetrable, delicate young shoots of grass were already sprouting, which taking root would so cover with their living verdure the grief that weighed her down that it would soon no longer be seen or noticed. The wound had begun to heal from within. At the end of January, Princess Mary left for Moscow, and the Count insisted on Natásha's going with her to consult the doctors. End of Section 3. This recording is in the public domain. Book 15, Chapter 4. Read for LibriVox.org. After the encounter at Vyazma, where Kutuzov had been unable to hold back his troops in their anxiety to overwhelm and cut off the enemy and so on, the farther movement of the fleeing French, and of the Russians who pursued them, continued as far as Krasnoye without a battle. The flight was so rapid that the Russian army pursuing the French could not keep up with them. Cavalry and artillery horses broke down, and the information received of the movements of the French was never reliable. The men in the Russian army were so worn out by this continuous marching at the rate of 27 miles a day that they could not go any faster. To realize the degree of exhaustion of the Russian army, it is only necessary to grasp clearly the meaning of the fact that, while not losing more than 5,000 killed and wounded after Tarútino, and less than 100 prisoners, the Russian army, which left that place 100,000 strong, reached Krasnoye with only 50,000. The rapidity of the Russian pursuit was just as destructive to our army as the flight of the French was to theirs. The only difference was that the Russian army moved voluntarily, with no such threat of destruction as hung over the French, and that the sick Frenchmen were left behind in enemy hands, while the sick Russians left behind were among their own people. The chief cause of the wastage of Napoleon's army was the rapidity of its movement, and a convincing proof of this is the corresponding decrease of the Russian army. Kutuzov, as far as was in his power, instead of trying to check the movement of the French as was desired in Petersburg and by the Russian army generals, directed his whole activity here, as he had done at Tarútino and Vyazma, to hastening it on while easing the movement of our army. But besides this, since the exhaustion and enormous diminution of the army caused by the rapidity of the advance had become evident, another reason for slackening the pace and delaying presented itself to Kutuzov. The aim of the Russian army was to pursue the French. The road the French would take was unknown, and so the closer our troops trod on their heels, the greater distance they had to cover. Only by following it some distance could one cut across the zigzag path of the French. All the artful maneuvers suggested by our generals meant fresh movements of the army and a lengthening of its marches, whereas the only reasonable aim was to shorten those marches. To that end Kutuzov's activity was directed during the whole campaign from Moscow to Vilna, not casually or intermittently, but so consistently that he never once deviated from it. So Kutuzov felt and knew, not by reasoning or science, but with the whole of his Russian being, what every Russian soldier felt, that the French were beaten, that the enemy was flying and must be driven out, but at the same time he, like the soldiers, realized all the hardship of this march, the rapidity of which was unparalleled for such a time of year. But to the generals, especially the foreign ones in the Russian army, who wished to distinguish themselves, to astonish somebody, and for some reason to capture a king or a duke, it seemed that now, when any battle must be horrible and senseless, was the very time to fight one and conquer somebody. Kutuzov merely shrugged his shoulders when one after another they presented projects of maneuvers to be made with those soldiers, ill-shod, insufficiently clad, and half-starved, who within a month and without fighting a battle had dwindled to half their number, and who at the best, if the flight continued, would have to go a greater distance than they had already traversed before they reached the frontier. This longing to distinguish themselves, to maneuver, to overthrow, and to cut off, showed itself particularly whenever the Russians stumbled on the French army. So it was at Krasnoye, where they expected to find one of 3 French columns, and stumbled instead on Napoleon himself with 16,000 men. Despite all Kutuzov's efforts to avoid that ruinous encounter and to preserve his troops, the massacre of the broken mob of French soldiers by worn-out Russians continued at Krasnoye for 3 days. Toll wrote a disposition. The first column will march to so-and-so, etc., and as usual nothing happened in accord with the disposition. Prince Eugene of Württemberg fired from a hill over the French crowds that were running past and demanded reinforcements which did not arrive. The French, avoiding the Russians, dispersed and hid themselves in the forest by night, making their way round as best they could, and continued their flight. Milorádovich, who said he did not want to know anything about the commissariat affairs of his detachment, and could never be found when he was wanted, that
Chevalier, sans peur et sans reproche.
knight without fear and without reproach, as he styled himself, who was fond of parleys with the French, sent envoys demanding their surrender, wasting time, and did not do what he was ordered to do. "I give you that column, lads," he said, riding up to the troops and pointing out the French to the cavalry. And the cavalry, with spurs and sabres urging on horses that could scarcely move, trotted with much effort to the column presented to them, that is to say, to a crowd of Frenchmen stark with cold, frostbitten and starving, and the column that had been presented to them threw down its arms and surrendered as it had long been anxious to do. At Krasnoye they took 26,000 prisoners, several hundred cannon, and a stick called a marshal's staff, and disputed as to who had distinguished himself, and were pleased with their achievement, though they much regretted not having taken Napoleon, or at least a marshal or a hero of some sort, and reproached one another, and especially Kutuzov, for having failed to do so. These men, carried away by their passions, were but blind tools of the most melancholy law of necessity, but considered themselves heroes, and imagined that they were accomplishing a most noble and honorable deed. They blamed Kutuzov, and said that from the very beginning of the campaign he had prevented their vanquishing Napoleon, that he thought nothing but satisfying his passions, and would not advance from the linen factories, because he was comfortable there, that at Krasnoye he checked the advance because on learning that Napoleon was there he had quite lost his head, and that it was probable that he had an understanding with Napoleon and had been bribed by him, and so on, and so on. Not only did his contemporaries, carried away by their passions, talk this way, but posterity and history have acclaimed Napoleon as grand, while Kutuzov is described by foreigners as a crafty, dissolute, weak old courtier, and by Russians as something indefinite, a sort of puppet, useful only because he had a Russian name. End of section 4. This recording is in the public domain.
Book 15, Chapter 5, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. In 1812 and 1813, Kutuzov was openly accused of blundering. The Emperor was dissatisfied with him, and in a history recently written by order of the highest authorities, it is said that Kutuzov was a cunning court liar, frightened of the name of Napoleon, and that by his blunders at Krasnoye and the Berezina he deprived the Russian army of the glory of complete victory over the French. Note: History of the year 1812, the character of Kutuzov and reflections on the unsatisfactory results of the battles at Krasnoye by Bogdanovich. End note. Such is the fate not of great men, grand hommes, whom the Russian mind does not acknowledge, but of those rare and always solitary individuals who, discerning the will of Providence, submit their personal will to it. The hatred and contempt of the crowd punish such men for discerning the higher laws. For Russian historians, strange and terrible to say, Napoleon, that most insignificant tool of history who never anywhere, even in exile, showed human dignity, Napoleon is the object of adulation and enthusiasm. He is grand. But Kutuzov, the man who from the beginning to the end of his activity in 1812, never once swerving by word or deed from Borodino to Vílna, presented an example exceptional in history of self-sacrifice and a present consciousness of the future importance of what was happening. Kutuzov seems to them something indefinite and pitiful, and when speaking of him and of the year 1812 they always seem a little ashamed. And yet it is difficult to imagine a historical character whose activity was so unswervingly directed to a single aim, and it would be difficult to imagine any aim more worthy or more consonant with the will of the whole people. Still more difficult would it be to find an instance in history of the aim of a historical personage being so completely accomplished as that to which all Kutuzov's efforts were directed in 1812. Kutuzov never talked of 40 centuries looking down from the pyramids, of the sacrifices he offered for the fatherland, or of what he intended to accomplish or had accomplished. In general, he said nothing about himself, adopted no prose, always appeared to be the simplest and most ordinary of men, and said the simplest and most ordinary things. He wrote letters to his daughters and to Madame de Staël, read novels, liked the society of pretty women, jested with generals, officers, and soldiers, and never contradicted those who tried to prove anything to him. When Count Rostopchín at the Yaúza bridge galloped up to Kutuzov with personal reproaches for having caused the destruction of Moscow, and said, "How was it you promised not to abandon Moscow without a battle?" Kutuzov replied, "And I shall not abandon Moscow without a battle," though Moscow was then already abandoned. When Arakchéev, coming to him from the Emperor, said that Ermólov ought to be appointed chief of the artillery, Kutuzov replied, "Yes, I was just saying so myself," though a moment before he had said quite the contrary. What did it matter to him, who then alone amid a senseless crowd understood the whole tremendous significance of what was happening? What did it matter to him whether Rostopchín attributed the calamities of Moscow to him or to himself? Still less could it matter to him who was appointed chief of the artillery. Not merely in these cases, but continually did that old man, who by experience of life had reached the conviction that thoughts and the words serving as their expression are not what move people, use quite meaningless words that happened to enter his head. But that man, so heedless of his words, did not once during the whole time of his activity utter one word inconsistent with the single aim towards which he moved throughout the whole war. Obviously in spite of himself, in very diverse circumstances, he repeatedly expressed his real thoughts with the bitter conviction that he would not be understood. Beginning with the battle of Borodinó, from which time his disagreement with those about him began, he alone said that the battle of Borodinó was a victory, and repeated this both verbally and in his dispatches and reports up to the time of his death. He alone said that the loss of Moscow is not the loss of Russia. In reply to Lauriston's proposal of peace, he said, "There can be no peace, for such is the people's will." He alone, during the retreat of the French, said that all our maneuvers are useless, everything is being accomplished of itself better than we could desire, that the enemy must be offered a golden bridge, that neither the Tarútino, the Vyázma, nor the Krásnoe battles were necessary, that we must keep some force to reach the frontier with, and that he would not sacrifice a single Russian for 10 Frenchmen. And this courtier, as he is described to us, who lies to Arakchéev to please the Emperor, he alone, incurring thereby the Emperor's displeasure, said in Vílna that to carry the war beyond the frontier is useless and harmful. Nor do words alone prove that only he understood the meaning of the events. His actions, without the smallest deviation, were all directed to one and the same threefold end: 1. To brace all his strength for conflict with the French; 2. To defeat them; and 3. To drive them out of Russia, minimizing as far as possible the sufferings of our people and of our army. This procrastinator Kutuzov, whose motto was "Patience and time," this enemy of decisive action, gave battle at Borodinó, investing the preparations for it with unparalleled solemnity. This Kutuzov, who, before the battle of Austerlitz began, said that it would be lost, he alone, in contradiction to everyone else, declared till his death that Borodinó was a victory, despite the assurance of generals that the battle was lost, and despite the fact that for an army to have to retire after winning a battle was unprecedented. He alone during the whole retreat insisted that battles, which were useless then, should not be fought, and that a new war should not be begun, nor the frontiers of Russia crossed. It is easy now to understand the significance of these events, if only we abstain from attributing to the activity of the mass aims that existed only in the heads of a dozen individuals, for the events and results now lie before us. But how did that old man, alone, in opposition to the general opinion, so truly discern the importance of the people's view of the events that in all his activity he was never once untrue to it. The source of that extraordinary power of penetrating the meaning of the events then occurring lay in the national feeling which he possessed in full purity and strength. Only the recognition of the fact that he possessed this feeling caused the people in so strange a manner, contrary to the Tsar's wish, to select him, an old man in disfavor, to be their representative in the national war, and only that feeling placed him on that highest human pedestal from which he, the commander-in-chief, devoted all his powers not to slaying and destroying men, but to saving and showing pity on them. That simple, modest, and therefore truly great figure could not be cast in the false mould of a European hero, the supposed ruler of men, that history has invented. To a lackey no man can be great, for a lackey has his own conception of greatness. End of chapter 5. This recording is in the public domain. Book 15, Chapter 6, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. The 5th of November was the first day of what is called the Battle of Krásnoe. Toward evening, after much disputing and many mistakes made by generals who did not go to their proper places, and after adjutants had been sent about with counter-orders, when it had become plain that the enemy was everywhere in flight and that there could and would be no battle, Kutuzov left Krásnoe and went to Dobroy, whither his headquarters had that day been transferred. The day was clear and frosty. Kutuzov rode to Dobroy on his plump little white horse, followed by an enormous suite of discontented generals who whispered among themselves behind his back. All along the road groups of French prisoners captured that day—there were 7,000 of them—were crowding to warm themselves at campfires. Near Dobroy an immense crowd of tattered prisoners, buzzing with talk and wrapped and bandaged in anything they had been able to get hold of, were standing in the road beside a long row of unharnessed French guns. At the approach of the commander-in-chief the buzz of talk ceased and all eyes were fixed on Kutuzov who, wearing a white cap with a red band and a padded overcoat that bulged on his round shoulders, moved slowly along the road on his white horse. One of the generals was reporting to him where the guns and prisoners had been captured. Kutuzov seemed preoccupied and did not listen to what the general was saying. He screwed up his eyes with a dissatisfied look as he gazed attentively and fixedly at these prisoners, who presented a specially wretched appearance. Most of them were disfigured by frost-bitten noses and cheeks, and nearly all had red, swollen and festering eyes. One group of the French stood close to the road, and two of them, one of whom had his face covered with sores, were tearing a piece of raw flesh with their hands. There was something horrible and bestial in the fleeting glance they threw at the riders, and the malevolent expression with which, after a glance at Kutuzov, the soldier with the sores immediately turned away and went on with what he was doing. Kutuzov looked long and intently at these two soldiers. He puckered his face, screwed up his eyes, and pensively swayed his head. At another spot he noticed a Russian soldier laughingly patting a Frenchman on the shoulder, saying something to him in a friendly manner, and Kutuzov with the same expression on his face again swayed his head. "What were you saying?" he asked the general, who, continuing his report, directed the commander-in-chief's attention to some standards captured from the French and standing in front of the Preobrazhénsk regiment. "Ah, the standards," said Kutuzov, evidently detaching himself with difficulty from the thoughts that preoccupied him. He looked about him absently. Thousands of eyes were looking at him from all sides, awaiting a word from him. He stopped in front of the Preobrazhénsk regiment, sighed deeply and closed his eyes. One of his suite beckoned to the soldiers carrying the standards to advance and surround the commander-in-chief with them. Kutuzov was silent for a few seconds and then, submitting with evident reluctance to the duty imposed by his position, raised his head and began to speak. A throng of officers surrounded him. He looked attentively around at the circle of officers, recognizing several of them. "I thank you all," he said, addressing the soldiers and then again the officers. In the stillness around him his slowly uttered words were distinctly heard. "I thank you all for your hard and faithful service. The victory is complete, and Russia will not forget you. Honor to you forever." He paused and looked around. "Lower its head! Lower it!" he said to a soldier who had accidentally lowered the French eagle he was holding before the Preobrazhénsk standards. "Lower, lower, that's it! Hurrah, lads!" he added, addressing the men with a rapid movement of his chin. "Hurrah!" roared thousands of voices. While the soldiers were shouting, Kutuzov leaned forward in his saddle and bowed his head, and his eye lit up with a mild and apparently ironic gleam. "You see, brothers," said he when the shouts had ceased, and all at once his voice and the expression of his face changed. It was no longer the commander-in-chief speaking, but an ordinary old man who wanted to tell his comrades something very important. There was a stir among the throng of officers and in the ranks of the soldiers, who moved that they might hear better what he was going to say. "You see, brothers, I know it's hard for you, but it can't be helped. Bear up, it won't be for long now. We'll see our visitors off and then we'll rest. The Tsar won't forget your service. It is hard for you, but still you are at home, while you see what they have come to," said he, pointing to the prisoners. "Worse off than our poorest beggars. While they were strong we didn't spare ourselves, but now we may even pity them. They are human beings too. Isn't it so, lads?" He looked around, and in the direct, respectful, wondering gaze fixed upon him he read sympathy with what he had said. His face grew brighter and brighter with an old man's mild smile, which drew the corners of his lips and eyes into a cluster of wrinkles. He ceased speaking and bowed his head as if in perplexity. "But after all, who asked them here? Serves them right, the bloody bastards!" he cried, suddenly lifting his head. And flourishing his whip he rode off at a gallop for the first time during the whole campaign, and left the broken ranks of the soldiers laughing joyfully and shouting "Hurrah!" Kutuzov's words were hardly understood by the troops. No one could have repeated the field marshal's address, begun solemnly and then changing into an old man's simple-hearted talk, but the hearty sincerity of that speech, the feeling of majestic triumph combined with pity for the foe and consciousness of the justice of our cause, exactly expressed by that old man's good-natured expletives, was not merely understood, but lay in the soul of every soldier and found expression in their joyous and long-sustained shouts. Afterwards, when one of the generals addressed Kutuzov, asking whether he wished his calèche to be sent for, Kutuzov in answering unexpectedly gave a sob, being evidently greatly moved. End of chapter 6. This recording is in the public domain. Book 15, Chapter 7, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Karenina. When the troops reached their night's halting place on the 8th of November, the last day of the Krásnoe battles, it was already growing dusk. All day it had been calm and frosty, with occasional lightly falling snow, and toward evening it began to clear. Through the falling snow a purple-black and starry sky showed itself, and the frost grew keener. An infantry regiment which had left Tarútino 3,000 strong, but now numbered only 900, was one of the first to arrive that night at its halting place, a village on the high-road. The quartermasters who met the regiment announced that all the huts were full of sick and dead Frenchmen, cavalrymen, and members of the staff. There was only one hut available for the regimental commander. The commander rode up to his hut. The regiment passed through the village and stacked its arms in front of the last huts. Like some huge, many-limbed animal, the regiment began to prepare its lair and its food. One part of it dispersed and waded knee-deep through the snow into a birch forest to the right of the village, and immediately the sound of axes and swords, the crashing of branches, and merry voices could be heard from there. Another section, amid the regimental wagons and horses which were standing in a group, was busy getting out cauldrons and rye biscuit, and feeding the horses. A third section scattered through the village, arranging quarters for the staff officers, carrying out the French corpses that were in the huts, and dragging away boards, dry wood and thatch from the roofs for the campfires, or wattle fences to serve for shelter. Some 15 men, with merry shouts, were shaking down the high wattle wall of a shed, the roof of which had already been removed. "Now then, all together, shove!" cried the voices, and the huge surface of the wall, sprinkled with snow and creaking with frost, was seen swaying in the gloom of the night. The lower stakes cracked more and more, and at last the wall fell, and with it the men who had been pushing it. Loud, coarse laughter and joyous shouts ensued. "Now then, catch hold in twos! Hand up the lever! That's it! Where are you shoving to? Now, all together! But wait a moment, boys! With a song!" All stood silent, and a soft, pleasant, velvety voice began to sing. At the end of the third verse, as the last note died away, 20 voices roared out at once: "Oh, that's it! All together! Heave away, boys!" But despite their united efforts the wattle hardly moved, and in the silence that followed the heavy breathing of the men was audible. "Here, you of the 6th Company! Devils that you are, lend a hand, will you? You may want us one of these days." Some 20 men of the 6th Company, who were on their way into the village, joined the haulers, and the wattle wall, which was about 35 feet long and 7 feet high, moved forward along the village street, swaying, pressing upon and cutting the shoulders of the gasping men. "Get along! Falling? What are you stopping for? There now!" Merry, senseless words of abuse flowed freely. "What are you up to?" suddenly came the authoritative voice of a sergeant major, who came upon the men who were hauling their burden. "There are gentry here, the general himself is in that hut, and you foul-mouthed devils, you brutes, I'll give it to you!" shouted he, hitting the first man who came in his way a swinging blow on the back. "Can't you make less noise?" The men became silent. The soldier who had been struck groaned and wiped his face, which had been scratched till it bled by his falling against the wattle. "There, how the devil hits out! He's made my face all bloody," said he in a frightened whisper when the sergeant major had passed on. "Don't you like it?" said a laughing voice, and moderating their tones the men moved forward. When they were out of the village they began talking again as loud as before, interlarding their talk with the same aimless expletives. In the hut which the men had passed the chief officers had gathered and were in animated talk over their tea about the events of the day and the maneuvers suggested for tomorrow. It was proposed to make a flank march to the left, cut off the vice-king, Murat, and capture him. By the time the soldiers had dragged the wattle fence to its place, the campfires were blazing on all sides, ready for cooking, the wood crackled, the snow was melting, and black shadows of soldiers flitted to and fro all over the occupied space where the snow had been trodden down. Axes and choppers were plied all around. Everything was done without any orders being given. Stores of wood were brought for the night, shelters were rigged up for the officers, cauldrons were being boiled, and muskets and accoutrements put in order. The wattle wall the men had brought was set up in a semicircle by the 8th Company as a shelter from the north, propped up by musket rests, and a campfire was built before it. They beat the tattoo, called the roll, had supper, and settled down round the fires for the night, some repairing their footgear, some smoking pipes, and some stripping themselves naked to steam the lice out of their shirts. End of Chapter 7. This recording is in the public domain.
Peace. Book 15, Chapter 8. Read for LibriVox.org. One would have thought that under the almost incredibly wretched conditions the Russian soldiers were in at that time, lacking warm boots and sheepskin coats, without a roof over their heads, in the snow with 18 degrees of frost, and without even full rations, the commissariat did not always keep up with the troops, they would have presented a very sad and depressing spectacle. On the contrary, the army had never, under the best material conditions, presented a more cheerful and animated aspect. This was because all who had begun to grow depressed or who lost strength were sifted out of the army day by day. All the physically or morally weak had long since been left behind, and only the flower of the army, physically and mentally, remained. More men collected behind the wattle fence of the 8th Company than anywhere else. 2 sergeants major were sitting with them, and their campfire blazed brighter than others. For leave to sit by their wattle, they demanded contributions of fuel. "Hey, Makiv! What has become of you, you son of a bitch? Are you lost, or have the wolves eaten you? Fetch some more wood!" shouted a red-haired and red-faced man, screwing up his eyes and blinking because of the smoke, but not moving back from the fire. "And you, jackdaw, go and fetch some wood," said he to another soldier. This red-haired man was neither a sergeant nor a corporal, but being robust, he ordered about those weaker than himself. The soldier they called Jackdaw, a thin little fellow with a sharp nose, rose obediently, and was about to go, but at that instant there came into the light of the fire the slender, handsome figure of a young soldier carrying a load of wood. "Bring it here, that's fine." They split up the wood, pressed it down on the fire, blew at it with their mouths, and fanned it with the skirts of their greatcoats, making the flames hiss and crackle. The men drew nearer and lit their pipes. The handsome young soldier who had brought the wood, setting his arms akimbo, began stamping his cold feet rapidly and deftly on the spot where he stood. "Mother, the dew is cold but clear. It's well that I'm a musketeer," he sang, pretending to hiccup after each syllable. "Look out, your soles will fly off," shouted the red-haired man, noticing that the sole of the dancer's boot was hanging loose. "What a fellow you are for dancing." The dancer stopped, pulled off the loose piece of leather, and threw it on the fire. "Right enough, friend," said he, and having sat down, took out of his knapsack a scrap of blue French cloth, and wrapped it round his foot. "It's the steam that spoils them," he added, stretching out his feet toward the fire. "They'll soon be issuing us new ones. They say that when we've finished hammering them we're to receive double kits." "And that son of a bitch Petrov is lagged behind after all, it seems," said one sergeant major. "I've had an eye on him this long while," said another. "Well, he's a poor sort of soldier. But in the 3rd Company they say 9 men were missing yesterday." "Yes, it's all very well, but when a man's feet are frozen, how can he walk?" "Eh? Don't talk nonsense," said a sergeant major. "Do you want to be doing the same?" said an old soldier, turning reproachfully to the man who had spoken of frozen feet. "Well, you know," said the sharp-nosed man they called Jackdaw in a squeaky and unsteady voice, raising himself at the other side of the fire, "a plump man gets thin, but for a thin one it's death. Take me now. I've got no strength left," he added with a sudden resolution, turning to the sergeant major. "Tell them to send me up to hospital. I'm aching all over. Anyway, I shan't be able to keep up." That'll do," replied the sergeant major quietly. The soldier said no more, and the talk went on. "What a lot of those Frenchies were taken today, and the fact is that not one of them had what you might call real boots on," said a soldier, starting a new theme. "They were no more than make-believes. The Cossacks have taken their boots. They were clearing the hut for the colonel and carried them out. It was pitiful to see them, boys," put in the dancer. "As they turned them over, one seemed still alive, and would you believe it, he jabbered something in their lingo. But they're a clean folk, lads," the first man went on. "He was white as birch bark, and some of them are such fine fellows you might think they were nobles." "Well, what do you think? They make soldiers of all classes there." "But they don't understand our talk at all," said the dancer with a puzzled smile. "I asked him whose subject he was, and he jabbered in his own way. A queer lot." "But it's strange, friends," continued the man who had wondered at their whiteness. "The peasants at Mozháysk were saying that when they began burying the dead, where the battle was, you know, well, those dead had been lying there for nearly a month, and says the peasant, they lie as white as paper, clean, and not much smell as a puff of powder smoke." "Was it from the cold?" asked someone. "You're a clever fellow. From the cold indeed. Why, it was hot. If it had been from the cold, ours would not have rotted either. But, he says, go up to ours and they're all rotten maggoty. So he says, we tie our faces up with kerchiefs and turn our heads away as we drag them off. We can hardly do it. But theirs, he says, are white as paper and not so much smell as a whiff of gunpowder." All were silent. "It must be from their food," said the sergeant major. "They used to gobble the same food as the gentry." No one contradicted him. That peasant near Mozaisk, where the battle was, said the men were all called up from 10 villages around, and they carted for 20 days and still didn't finish carting the dead away. And as for the wolves, he says, "That was a real battle," said an old soldier. "It's the only one worth remembering. But since that, it's only been tormenting folk. And you know, Daddy, the day before yesterday we ran at them, and my word, they didn't let us get near before they just threw down their muskets and went on their knees. 'Pardon,' they say. That's only one case. They say Platov took Polion himself twice, but he didn't know the right charm. He catches them and catches them. No good. He turns into a bird in his hands and flies away, and there's no way of killing him either. You're a first-class liar, Keslev, when I come to look at you. Liar, indeed! It's the real truth. If he fell into my hands, when I caught him, I'd bury him in the ground with an aspen stake to fix him down. What a lot of men he's ruined. Well, anyhow, we're going to end it. He won't come here again," remarked the old soldier, yawning. The conversation flagged, and the soldiers began settling down to sleep. "Look at the stars. It's wonderful how they shine. You'd think the women had spread out their linen," said one of the men, gazing with admiration at the Milky Way. "That's a sign of good harvest next year. We shall want some more wood. You warm your back and the belly gets frozen. That's queer. Oh, Lord. What are you pushing for? Is the fire only for you? Look how he's sprawling." In the silence that ensued, the snoring of those who had fallen asleep could be heard. Others turned over and warmed themselves, now and again exchanging a few words. From a campfire 100 paces off came a sound of general merry laughter. "Hark at them roaring there in the 5th Company," said one of the soldiers, "and what a lot of them there are." One of the men got up and went over to the 5th Company. "They're having such fun," said he, coming back. "2 Frenchies have turned up. One's quite frozen and the other's an awful swaggerer. He's singing songs. Oh, I'll go across and have a look." And several of the men went over to the 5th Company. End of Book 15, Chapter 8. This recording is in the public domain. War and Peace, Book 15, Chapter 9, read for LibriVox.org. The 5th Company was bivouacking at the very edge of the forest. A huge campfire was blazing brightly in the midst of the snow, lighting up the branches of trees heavy with hoarfrost. About midnight they heard the sound of steps in the snow of the forest and the crackling of dried branches. "A bear, lads," said one of the men. They all raised their heads to listen, and out of the forest into the bright firelight stepped 2 strangely clad human figures clinging to one another. These were 2 Frenchmen who had been hiding in the forest. They came up to the fire, hoarsely uttering something in a language our soldiers did not understand. One was taller than the other. He wore an officer's hat and seemed quite exhausted. On approaching the fire he had been going to sit down but fell. The other, a short, sturdy soldier with a shawl tied round his head, was stronger. He raised his companion and said something, pointing to his mouth. The soldiers surrounded the Frenchman, spread a great coat on the ground for the sick man, and brought some buckwheat porridge and vodka for both of them. The exhausted French officer was Rambal, and the man with his head wrapped in the shawl was Morel, his orderly. When Morel had drunk some vodka and finished his bowl of porridge, he suddenly became unnaturally merry, and chattered incessantly to the soldiers, who could not understand him. Rambal refused food, and resting his head on his elbow, lay silent beside the campfire, looking at the Russian soldiers with red and vacant eyes. Occasionally he emitted a long-drawn groan, and then again became silent. Morel, pointing to his shoulders, tried to impress on the soldiers the fact that Rambal was an officer and ought to be warmed. A Russian officer who had come up to the fire sent to ask his colonel whether he would not take a French officer into his hut to warm him, and when the messenger returned and said that the colonel wished the officer to be brought to him, Rambal was told to go. He rose and tried to walk, but staggered and would have fallen had not a soldier standing by held him up. "You won't do it again, eh?" said one of the soldiers, winking and turning mockingly to Rambal. "Oh, you fool! Why talk rubbish, lout that you are? a real peasant, came rebukes from all sides addressed to the jesting soldier. They surrounded Ramballe, lifted him on the crossed arms of two soldiers, and carried him to the hut. Ramballe put his arms around their necks while they carried him, and began wailing plaintively. "Oh, you fine fellows, my kind, kind friends! These are men! Oh, my brave, kind friends!" And he leaned his head against the shoulder of one of them, like a child. Meanwhile, Morel was sitting in the best place by the fire, surrounded by the soldiers. Morel, a short, sturdy Frenchman with inflamed and streaming eyes, was wearing a woman's cloak, and had a shawl tied woman fashion round his head over his cap. He was evidently tipsy, and was singing a French song in a hoarse, broken voice, with an arm thrown round the nearest soldier. The soldiers simply held their sides as they watched him. Now then, teach us how it goes. I'll soon pick it up. How is it?" said the man, a singer and a wag, whom Morel was embracing.
Vive Henri IV, vive ce roi vaillant, sang Morel winking, ce diable à quatre.
"Long live Henry IV, that valiant king, that rowdy devil. Vive Arica, vive Sufavaru, Sebya de Boclaya," repeated the soldier, flourishing his arm and really catching the tune. "Bravo!" rose their rough, joyous laughter from all sides. Morel, wrinkling up his face, laughed too. "Well, go on, go on."
Qui eut le triple talent de boire, de battre et d'être un ver galant.
"Who had a triple talent for drinking, for fighting, and for being a gallant old boy. It goes smoothly, too. Well now, Zalatayev." Zalatayev brought out with effort. He drawled, laboriously pursing his lips. "Les tripes à la dubidabada et de travaglala," he sang. "Fine, just like the Frenchie. Do you want some more to eat?" "Give him some porridge. It takes a long time to get filled up after starving." They gave him some more porridge, and Morel, with a laugh, set to work on his third bowl. All the young soldiers smiled gaily as they watched him. The older men, who thought it undignified to amuse themselves with such nonsense, continued to lie at the opposite side of the fire, but one would occasionally raise himself on an elbow and glance at Morel with a smile. "They are men too," said one of them as he wrapped himself in his coat. "Even wormwood grows on its own root." "Oh, Lord, Lord, how starry it is! Tremendous! That means a hard frost." They all grew silent. The stars, as if knowing that no one was looking at them, began to disport themselves in the dark sky, now flaring up, now vanishing, now trembling. They were busy whispering something gladsome and mysterious to one another. End of Book 15, Chapter 9. This recording is in the public domain.
War and Peace, Book 15, Chapter 10. Read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Patinama. The French army melted away at the uniform rate of a mathematical progression, and that crossing of the Berezina, about which so much has been written, was only one intermediate stage in its destruction, and not at all the decisive episode of the campaign. If so much has been, and still is, written about the Berezina, on the French side this is only because at a broken bridge across that river the calamities their army had been previously enduring were suddenly concentrated at one moment into a tragic spectacle that remained in every memory, and on the Russian side merely because in Petersburg, far from the seat of war, a plan, again one of Pfuel's, had been devised to catch Napoleon in a strategic trap at the Berezina river. Everyone assured himself that all would happen according to plan, and therefore insisted that it was just the crossing of the Berezina that destroyed the French army. In reality, the results of the crossing were much less disastrous to the French, in guns and men lost, than Krasnoye had been, as the figures show. The sole importance of the crossing of the Berezina lies in the fact that it plainly and indubitably proved the fallacy of all the plans for cutting off the enemy's retreat and the soundness of the only possible line of action, the one Kutuzov and the general mass of the army demanded, namely, simply to follow the enemy up. The French crowd fled at a continually increasing speed, and all its energy was directed to reaching its goal. It fled like a wounded animal, and it was impossible to block its path. This was shown not so much by the arrangements it made for crossing as by what took place at the bridges. When the bridges broke down, unarmed soldiers, people from Moscow, and women with children who were with the French transport, all, carried on by vis inertiae, pressed forward into boats and into the ice-covered water, and did not surrender. That impulse was reasonable. The condition of fugitives and of pursuers was equally bad. As long as they remained with their own people, each might hope for help from his fellows in the definite place he held among them. But those who surrendered, while remaining in the same pitiful plight, would be on a lower level to claim a share in the necessities of life. The French did not need to be informed of the fact that half the prisoners, with whom the Russians did not know what to do, perished of cold and hunger despite the captors' desire to save them. They felt that it could not be otherwise. The most compassionate Russian commanders, those favorable to the French, and even the Frenchmen in the Russian service, could do nothing for the prisoners. The French perished from the conditions to which the Russian army was itself exposed. It was impossible to take bread and clothes from our hungry and indispensable soldiers to give to the French, who, though not harmful, or hated, or guilty, were simply unnecessary. Some Russians even did that, but they were exceptions. Certain destruction lay behind the French, but in front there was hope. The ships had been burned, there was no salvation save in collective flight, and on that the whole strength of the French was concentrated. The farther they fled, the more wretched became the plight of the remnant, especially after the Berezina, on which, in consequence of the Petersburg Plan, special hopes had been placed by the Russians, and the keener grew the passions of the Russian commanders, blamed one another, and Kutuzov most of all. Anticipation that the failure of the Petersburg-Berezina plan would be attributed to Kutuzov led to dissatisfaction, contempt, and ridicule, more and more strongly expressed. The ridicule and contempt were of course expressed in a respectful form, making it impossible for him to ask wherein he was to blame. They did not talk seriously to him. When reporting to him or asking for his sanction, they appeared to be fulfilling a regrettable formality, but they winked behind his back and tried to mislead him at every turn. Because they could not understand him, all these people assumed that it was useless to talk to the old man, that he would never grasp the profundity of their plans, that he would answer with his phrases, which they thought were mere phrases, about a golden bridge, about the impossibility of crossing the frontier with a crowd of tatterdemalions, and so forth. They had heard all that before, and all he said, that it was necessary to await provisions, or that the men had no boots, was so simple, while what they proposed was so complicated and clever, that it was evident that he was old and stupid, and that they, though not in power, were commanders of genius. After the junction with the army of the brilliant admiral and Petersburg hero Wittgenstein, this mood and the gossip of the staff reached their maximum. Kutuzov saw this and merely sighed and shrugged his shoulders. Only once, after the affair of the Berezina, did he get angry and write to Bennigsen, who reported separately to the Emperor, the following letter: On account of your spells of ill health, will your Excellency please be so good as to set off for Kaluga on receipt of this, and there await further commands and appointments from His Imperial Majesty. But after Bennigsen's departure, the Grand Duke Tsarevich Konstantin Pavlovich joined the army. He had taken part in the beginning of the campaign, but had subsequently been removed from the army by Kutuzov. Now, having come to the army, he informed Kutuzov of the Emperor's displeasure at the poor success of our forces and the slowness of their advance. The Emperor intended to join the army personally in a few days' time. The old man, experienced in court as well as in military affairs, the same Kutuzov who in August had been chosen commander-in-chief against the sovereign's wishes, and who had removed the Grand Duke and heir apparent from the army, who on his own authority and contrary to the Emperor's will had decided on the abandonment of Moscow, now realized at once that his day was over, that his part was played, and that the power he was supposed to hold was no longer his. And he understood this not merely from the attitude of the court. He saw on the one hand that the military business in which he had played his part was ended, and felt that his mission was accomplished, and at the same time he began to be conscious of the physical weariness of his aged body and of the necessity of physical rest. On the 29th of November, Kutuzov entered Vílna, his dear Vílna, as he called it. Twice during his career Kutuzov had been governor of Vílna. In that wealthy town, which had not been injured, he found old friends and associations, besides the comforts of life of which he had so long been deprived. And he suddenly turned from the cares of army and state and, as far as the passions that seethed around him allowed, immersed himself in the quiet life to which he had formerly been accustomed, as if all that was taking place and all that had still to be done in the realm of history did not concern him at all. Chichagov, one of the most zealous cutters off and breakers up, who had first wanted to effect a diversion in Greece and then in Warsaw, but never wished to go where he was sent, Chichagov, noted for the boldness with which he spoke to the Emperor, and who considered Kutuzov to be under an obligation to him, because when he was sent to make peace with Turkey in 1811, independently of Kutuzov, and found that peace had already been concluded, he admitted to the Emperor that the merit of securing that peace was really Kutuzov's. This Chichagov was the first to meet Kutuzov at the castle where the latter was to stay. In undress naval uniform, with a dirk, and holding his cap under his arm, he handed Kutuzov a garrison report and the keys of the town. The contemptuously respectful attitude of the younger men to the old man in his dotage was expressed in the highest degree by the behavior of Chichagov, who knew of the accusations that were being directed against Kutuzov. When speaking to Chichagov, Kutuzov incidentally mentioned that the vehicles packed with china that had been captured from him at Borisov had been recovered and would be restored to him. "You mean to imply that I have nothing to eat out of? On the contrary, I can supply you with everything, even if you want to give dinner parties," warmly replied Chichagov, who tried by every word he spoke to prove his own rectitude, and therefore imagined Kutuzov to be animated by the same desire. Kutuzov, shrugging his shoulders, replied with a subtle, penetrating smile, "I meant merely to say what I said." Contrary to the Emperor's wish, Kutuzov detained the greater part of the army at Vílna. Those about him said that he became extraordinarily slack and physically feeble during his stay in that town. He attended to army affairs reluctantly, left everything to his generals, and while awaiting the Emperor's arrival led a dissipated life. Having left Petersburg on the 7th of December with his suite, Count Tolstoy, Prince Volkonsky, Arakcheyev, and others, The Emperor reached Vilna on the 11th, and in his travelling sleigh drove straight to the castle. In spite of the severe frost, some 100 generals and staff officers in full parade uniform stood in front of the castle, as well as a guard of honor of the Semyonov regiment. A courier, who galloped to the castle in advance, in a troika with 3 foam-flecked horses, shouted, "Coming!" and Konovnitsyn rushed into the vestibule to inform Kutuzov, who was waiting in the hall porter's little lodge. A minute later, the old man's large, stout figure in full dress uniform, his chest covered with orders and a scarf drawn round his stomach, waddled out into the porch. He put on his hat with its peaks to the sides, and, holding his gloves in his hand and walking with an effort sideways down the steps to the level of the street, took in his hand the report he had prepared for the Emperor. There was running to and fro and whispering. Another troika flew furiously up, and then all eyes were turned on an approaching sleigh, in which the figures of the Emperor and Volkonsky could already be descried. From the habit of 50 years all this had a physically agitating effect on the old general. He carefully and hastily felt himself all over, readjusted his hat, and pulling himself together, drew himself up, and at the very moment when the Emperor, having alighted from the sleigh, lifted his eyes to him, handed him the report, and began speaking in his smooth, ingratiating voice. The Emperor, with a rapid glance, scanned Kutuzov from head to foot, frowned for an instant, but immediately mastering himself went up to the old man, extended his arms and embraced him. And this embrace too, owing to a long-standing impression related to his innermost feelings, had its usual effect on Kutuzov, and he gave a sob. The Emperor greeted the officers and the Semyonov guard, and again, pressing the old man's hand, went with him into the castle. When alone with the field-marshal, the Emperor expressed his dissatisfaction at the slowness of the pursuit and at the mistakes made at Krasnoye and the Berezina, and informed him of his intentions for a future campaign abroad. Kutuzov made no rejoinder or remark. The same submissive, expressionless look with which he had listened to the Emperor's commands on the field of Austerlitz 7 years before settled on his face now. When Kutuzov came out of the study and with lowered head was crossing the ballroom with his heavy waddling gait, he was arrested by someone's voice saying, "Your Serene Highness." Kutuzov raised his head and looked for a long while into the eyes of Count Tolstoy, who stood before him, holding a silver salver on which lay a small object. Kutuzov seemed not to understand what was expected of him. Suddenly he seemed to remember. A scarcely perceptible smile flashed across his puffy face, and bowing low and respectfully he took the object that lay on the salver. It was the Order of St. George of the First Class. End of chapter 10. Recording by Ernst Patinama.
This recording is in the public domain.